Check one, check two. I'm live. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here today and good to see you here today. I appreciate the opportunity that you've given me to be here with you all this morning. I certainly enjoy it an awful lot, and I certainly hope to not hurt your ears too bad, so I'll try not to ramble for no more than maybe 2-3 hours, something like that, maybe just enough time for you to take a nap maybe this morning. But I do appreciate the opportunity an awful lot. I always enjoy the opportunity to preach and certainly to see Christians from all over and a lot of familiar faces. I didn't feel like it was that long ago since I was here last, but when I started going through my notes and things, I realized it's been a couple of years, roughly, maybe a little bit more. It feels like an awful lot longer some days and not so long other days. But it's good to see you again. If I forget your name, I apologize. It's not because I'm holding any kind of a grudge. I've just slept since then, and so I hope I can become reacquainted with you again. And certainly want to thank Danny and Sheila. I've known them since day one. I brought my mom with me today. Y'all have got some really good folks here, I know, but Danny and Sheila they're good ones. They're good ones. So if you want any dirt on me, they've got it. They've got plenty of it since day one. But again, thank you all for the opportunity you have given me. So I certainly hope to be of some encouragement and of some edification to you today. And so if you have your Bibles handy, if you want to go ahead and make your way over to the book of Luke. The book of Luke is where we're going to spend some time this morning. And in the 5th chapter, Luke chapter 5. And as you're making your way over there, the title for our lesson today is Fishers of Men. And I suspect that this story that I'm about to share with you is one that you've probably read or heard before. I'm a sucker for a good story. I like a good story. If I'm watching a movie, reading a book, regardless of what kind of a story it is, as long as the story's good, I'm pretty easy to reel in. And this is just a really, really good Bible story. And like all of the stories in the Bible, it's a true one. As you may have known from my past visits here, I love history. And history's true. Whether you believe it or not, it happened. And this is a true account. And what I like about it a little bit more is it's a fishing story. Anybody ever told or heard a good fishing story before? It's hard to find a good fishing story that's also a true fishing story, isn't it? I caught a fish that was this big. It just, next thing you know, you caught a shark in Barren River Lake, right? And so anywho, so it's a good fishing story. But it's a story I think that we can learn an awful lot from as Christians. And I hope to kind of turn this lesson this morning into a small 2-part lesson this morning, because I think there's some big lessons we can get from this story. But we're going to dig into one of Paul's letters a little bit later this morning and draw out maybe some more lessons from that. So Luke chapter 5 is where we'll get started. This story is also recorded for us in Matthew chapter 4 and in Mark chapter 1. We're going to read Luke's account. And so starting in verse 1, this is what Luke records for us in his gospel account. Luke chapter 5 verse 1, this is what we read. He says, "Now it happened that while the crowd was pressing around him and listening to the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret." And so just quick pause. This is Jesus we're talking about. He started his ministry. He's been doing some teaching, but he's gathering his apostles together at this stage. And so verse 2, we go on to read, "And he saw 2 boats lying at the edge of the lake, but the fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. And he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from the land. And he sat down and began teaching the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, 'Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch.' Simon answered and said, 'Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. But I will do as you say and let down the nets.' When they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. And so they signaled to their partners in the other boat for them to come and help them. And they came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw that he fell down at Jesus' feet, saying, 'Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man.' For amazement had seized him and all his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, 'Do not fear. From now on you will be catching men.' And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Pretty cool story, isn't it? True story. That really happened. You ever had a fishing adventure like that one? Not quite. I can remember several years ago I went on a certain fishing adventure with a couple of people, a few people in this room. And I'll never forget, the fish was allegedly so big somebody had to get a net to put the fish in the net. And for some reason I thought that they were going to take the rod. And so I let go of the rod, and now that rod sits in the bottom of Barren River Lake. And the running joke was I was supposed to go back when they let the lake down and get it. I never did. But man, talk about a fishing story. I mean, to catch so many fish that the boats began to sink. But of course, there's a lot more that's going on here. And what in the world happened? Well, this was early in Jesus' ministry. So this is when his ministry's gotten started. And in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we know roughly that Jesus lived around 33-ish years. But in these 4 books, we only really get a glimpse at roughly 3-ish years of Jesus' life. And some of the accounts we see, when he was young, some of the things that he did. But we really only know about Jesus in his adulthood, as far as his physical life on the earth. And at this stage, his ministry has been growing. Certainly people have come to the realization that he is not just an average Joe. He's capable of performing miracles. He's capable of drawing in a crowd. And by Luke chapter 5, there are so many people who have become acquainted with this Jesus, as he's on the banks of this great body of water, this big lake. They're wanting to hear something from him. And so at this point in the Gospels, things are going really good. I know by the time we get a little bit later into the Gospels, things get very serious very fast. But at this stage, Jesus is a popular guy that a lot of people liked. They were interested in what he had to say. And there were so many that he had to use a couple of boats as a pulpit. As they're on the bank of this water, these people have gathered around and they say, hey, Jesus, we want to hear more. And so he gets on the boat and kind of pushes off from the bank, perhaps as a means that they all might be able to hear what it is he has to say. But as he's in these boats, this is where the story gets really exciting, right? He's with these different fellas, and one of these fellas is named Simon. And as they're in these boats together, Jesus goes up to Simon and he says, hey, we're out in the water. I want to show you something. He says, those nets you've been using, throw them out into the water real quick. And Simon is a fisherman by trade. I'm just a hobby fisherman, maybe a handful of times a year, maybe at most. But this is Simon's livelihood. He's an expert in his field, potentially. And here he is, this expert fisherman, professional fisherman. Cool title, by the way. That'd be a good job, maybe. Not if you had to do it to survive, maybe. I couldn't live very long. But Simon's job is to catch these fish. And when Jesus tells him this, he says, look, he says, Master, he recognizes Jesus as somebody of authority, somebody to listen to, teacher, master. He says, we've worked hard all night. We're professional fishermen. We've been fishing all night, and we can assure you there are no fish in this lake. You ever fished in lakes like that? There's got to be no fish, right? Can't catch a thing. And these guys, they're professional fishermen. And this man, who as far as they're concerned is a popular teacher, who they might have known as a son of a carpenter, is starting to tell them how to fish. Now you think about that practically. How would you like that? If I showed up to your job and you weren't having a really good day, maybe you're a car salesman, and I said, hey, I'll tell you how to sell a car. Do this. Probably wouldn't like it very much, but Simon gave him the benefit of the doubt and said, look, we haven't caught anything all night, but you know what? I'll do as you say. So evidently there was something Simon saw there. Maybe he had heard of Jesus. Maybe he had heard of what he was capable of, and maybe heard of some of the things that he said. And so he said, we'll do it. Okay. And in the back of his mind, maybe I could imagine Simon thinking, oh, we're not going to catch a thing. This guy, we're going to show this guy a thing or two. Maybe he thought that, maybe he didn't. I don't know. But it's in verse 6 that everybody watching and everybody, especially in the boats, realized that Jesus was something special, that he is someone special. And you remember what happened, right? As a kid, this is a story, I bet if you went to Sunday school growing up, you heard this story. Cool story. What happens is as they throw their nets out into the water, they start to reel these nets in, and the nets are literally busting at the seams. And in fact, as he starts to reel the nets in even more, we go on to read that Simon signals to his other buddies and says, we need not just more nets, we need more boats because the boat's starting to sink. Now, boy, have you had a day like that. So many fish that the boat is starting to be less buoyant than the force of the water that now they're all going to be fish. There they are. And so they get over there and they fill up their boats. And now they all are seemingly starting to sink. And naturally, Simon is very fearful. And we're told he fell down at Jesus' feet and recognized that, again, he was somebody special. And in fact, Simon said these words. He says, "Go away from me." Why did he tell Jesus that? Was he mad that his boat was sinking? Not necessarily. He drops at Jesus' feet and says, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." He realized that he wasn't worthy to be in the presence of such a great fisherman who was capable of doing something like this. He knew that Jesus was a very special individual. And Jesus did this a lot in his ministry. He would take typical daily things and elevate them to a higher level. He would take simple stories about, say, things like farming and make them about something a whole lot more than farming. He would take something as simple as fishing and make it a whole lot more about fishing. And when you read a little bit further, we realize that Jesus was not giving them a fishing lesson here, was he? If you want to know how to catch fish, at the very least, you have to throw something in the water, so that's good advice. If you want to catch anything, you got to go out there and try. But in verses 9 down through 11, he made it clear that he had a new mission for them. And you know what that mission was, right? Verse 9, he wrote, "For amazement had seized him, and all his companions, because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon." And then Jesus said these words. He says, "Do not fear, from now on you will catch men." In Matthew's account and in Mark's account, they use that phrase, "I will make you fishers of men." And what did they do? Well, that's what they proceeded to do. Jesus had made it clear that they had a new job, a new purpose on this earth, and that was to catch people. Now, whenever I think of catching people, did anybody ever watch that movie with Dick Van Dyke, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang? You remember the child catcher? That's not the kind of people catching Jesus was talking about, was it? He was talking about reaching at people's souls and using these, eventually 12 apostles, to tell the world about Jesus. Something else I think about a lot too when I think of this story was a quote by a guy you've probably heard of. His name was Henry David Thoreau. And there's a quote. I bet if any of you have ever been involved in fishing, you've heard of this quote. He said, "Many men go fishing all their lives without knowing that it is not the fish they're after." These men had been fishermen their whole life, and little did they know until this moment. And maybe in this moment they didn't fully realize the work that they were about to begin, but they were about to be fishing for something more than fish. They were to fish for other people's souls. And so, as kind of the part one to this story, as Christians, if I were to go around the room and ask you, what is a chief responsibility we have on this earth? I bet at least one of you would say that our job is to preach the gospel to lost people and help save souls. That is one of the most important responsibilities we have, isn't it? And might I add, it's not just a responsibility, it's not a suggestion either, is it? It's a command. And in stories like this one, we see the beginning of this work of men like Simon and John and James. And when you skip to the end of the Gospels, if you go back with me to the book of Matthew just real quick, and then we're going to skip to the end of the book of Mark too. But at the end of the book of Matthew chapter 28, by the time Jesus' death has already taken place and his resurrection has taken place and he's about to ascend back up into heaven, he reminded his closest followers of this very crucial responsibility they had to go out and preach the gospel. In Matthew 28, down in verse 16, Matthew recorded this for us. He said, "But the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had designated. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some were doubtful. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, 'All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations,
baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. When Jesus said that, it wasn't a suggestion, was it? He was telling His apostles, His disciples, look, here's a responsibility I want you to take up. And that is to go out and make disciples of the world. Go out and make disciples of the world. And in Mark's account, if you turn to his account in chapter 16, down in verse 14, Mark records the same incident, worded slightly differently. But in Mark chapter 16, down in verse 14, Mark recorded these words. He said, after He appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at the table, He reproached them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen Him after He had risen. And He said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. And He goes on to say, he who has believed and is baptized shall be saved, but he who has disbelieved shall be condemned. These signs will accompany those who have believed in My name. They will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues, they will pick up serpents, and if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them, and they will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. And so in both of these accounts, Jesus gives an order to His closest followers that He told these folks from the very beginning to go out and be fishers of men, to go out and preach the gospel to all of creation. Now, as Christians, we could close up shop here and say, okay, that's the lesson. As Christians, we need to go out and preach the gospel. But that's a lot easier said than done, isn't it? That's a difficult thing to do, especially to people who aren't Christians. For me personally, it is. Maybe it's not for you, but that's a hard thing for me to do. You know, when I'm in a room of people like this, I get nervous sometimes. I may not show it, but I get nervous, but I feel comfortable. And I feel comfortable because we're all on the same page. We all believe in the same book. We all have a like-minded faith. And if there was any group of people we should feel most comfortable about talking about our faith with, it's fellow Christians, right? Because we share that. But when it comes to spreading this gospel, it is an intimidating thing. And as a result, sometimes it can be easy to read verses like this and think, well, we know we need to do it, but we'll get around to it eventually. And then 10 years go by, 20 years, 30, 40, 50, 60, and so many years go by, and maybe you think, maybe I'm not doing this as good as I should be. And again, is this something that we need to take seriously? Absolutely. Absolutely we do. I'll never forget something a good friend of mine said, and he was of a different faith. And maybe that's one of the reasons it really hung with me. He had several things that he believed that I disagreed with, but we often talked a lot, and I learned a lot from him, and I'd like to think he learned a little bit from me. But one thing he said that I agreed with a whole lot that always stuck with me, he asked me one day, he said, Luke, have you ever thought about one responsibility and opportunity that we as Christians get on earth that we don't get in heaven? And maybe I've shared this with you before, but I sat there, and whenever you're talking with somebody who disagrees with you, you never want them to think that they know more than you, right? If somebody disagrees with you, you want to make sure you kind of got a leg up on them. And so I sat there thinking, and I looked off in the distance, well, yeah, there's all sorts of things we can do in heaven that we can't do on earth. And he said, well, name one. Name one thing that Christians get to do on earth that they're supposed to do that they can't do in heaven. And I finally just had to kind of pull up the white flag and say, I don't know. And he said, they can't save sinners. And I thought, whoa. And he said, you know why? And I said, well, I think I do. He said, because there's not going to be any there. So when you think about it from that perspective, that adds that much more meat to it, doesn't it? As Christians, this responsibility of spreading the gospel is not just something God wants us to do, but it's something we only have a limited amount of time to do. While we're here on this earth, among people who aren't Christians, who don't believe, and it's a big deal. And I know it's a big deal, not just because of these few verses that we've read, but when you go through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what did Jesus do constantly? He was teaching. In fact, there were some people who never even addressed Him as Jesus. You know what they called Him? Master or teacher. Hey, teacher. Because that's what He was always doing. And when you get into books like the book of Acts, Mark's account kind of touches on this, all these signs that took place. When you go through Acts, what do you see these apostles constantly doing? Teaching. What do you see these individuals doing that they taught? Teaching. You read about Christians who maybe weren't Christians for very long, and then eventually you read about people like Paul, whose job it was to persecute Christians. And what do people like him eventually do when they become Christians? Well, they start spreading the gospel to make other Christians. And it's this contagious cycle that's a good kind of contagious, that just spreads over and over and over. And that's what's expected. And again, that's a tall order. And so the first big thing I want us to think about this morning is, are we spreading the gospel like we should be? Are we taking this responsibility seriously? And I hope that you are. I know that I can certainly do better in that department. And maybe you know people who are really good at that. I've had some friends in my life who were phenomenal at spreading the gospel to other people. I remember I had a good friend of mine, I won't say his name, but really good fella. And I'll never forget that we would be meeting with other friends, and I would say, well, so-and-so thinks this way, so-and-so thinks this way, and I've tried to talk to so-and-so about this, but they never listen, and it never failed. He could be the kind of a guy, he would walk into a room and say, hey, where do you go to church? And they'd say, well, I go to church here. He'd say, well, I go to church here. I think we disagree on some things. Why don't we talk about it? And just as smooth as butter. I mean, he could just have a conversation with people. You ever known people like that? And he was good at it. And it is a hard skill. I think it's something that requires some work. It requires some effort. But one thing in interactions like that I learned is that when we do it, how we do it does matter. And so real quickly now, if you just want to turn with me over to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. When Paul was recording his ability to preach the gospel to others, he spoke to the Christians in Corinth about how preaching the gospel does matter. And so even though it's important to know that we need to do it, like anything, we need to have a good strategy. You know, if you were to build a house, you're going to think about how you're going to build it, right? If you're going to go play a game or go hunting or go fishing, you're going to think about your strategy a little bit. Well, when it comes to spreading the gospel, you do need to think about your strategy. And if you're like me, maybe you didn't think about that a whole lot, and maybe that's why you might struggle with it like I have, because the strategy does matter. In the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is writing to these Christians in Corinth. And he is writing to people who are already Christians. But if you read through the book, there's a lot of people you might be wondering about their faith, mightn't you? You ever read through Corinthians before? A lot of stuff going on there. I'll just go ahead and tell you, if Corinthians gave me a call and said, hey, do you want to preach sometime? I might have reservations. I don't know if that's a good idea. It's a pretty rough spot. But Paul didn't care. He knew the seriousness of spreading the gospel. And so by 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he talks about the idea of being selfless in his work of spreading the gospel. Not selfish, but selfless. And we won't pick through everything in this chapter, but we'll just read through this chapter just to get a good glimpse of it and then hone in on a couple of spots. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in verse 1, Paul wrote these words. He said, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this. Do we have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? He goes on to read in verse 6. Or do only Barnabas and I not have the right to refrain from working? Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? I am not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does not the law also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. If we sow spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Let's read that one more time in verse 12. Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. As we get ready to lead a little bit further, that verse 12 is a key verse when we start to move a little bit further in this chapter. Paul was so concerned about spreading the gospel to other people that he wanted to make sure that how he did it and how he went about living his life caused no hindrance to ensuring that other people could understand the gospel. To what extreme was Paul willing to go to ensure that other people know the gospel? Well, in verse 13, he goes on to say, Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. But I have used none of these things. And I am not writing these things so that will be done so in my case, for it would be better for me to die than have any man make my boast an empty one. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I did this voluntarily, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. What then is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win the more. To the Jews I become as a Jew, so that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. For I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Now I know there's a lot of words here, and I'm not going to try to pick apart everything here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. But in the latter part of that chapter, Paul talks about his efforts to spread the gospel to other people. And especially in verses 19 to verse 23. Do you see that pattern of selflessness that Paul takes? I mean, in verse 12, he's trying to do everything he can so as not to hinder the gospel of Christ. And even though as an apostle and as a Christian, there were privileges that he had, he sacrificed those privileges. Why did he do that? To help other people know the gospel. And I really like verses 19 through 23 because he says all this to build up to these verses, I think. And he says these words in 19 to 23, how he becomes all things to all men. He becomes so completely and totally selfless in hopes that other people might obey the gospel. What's his strategy? What's his how-to? To move self out of the way and put others first, to be servants to others in hopes that he can share the gospel with them and help them understand it. Completely and totally selfless. I like how he says, when he was in the company of Jews, he became like a Jew. Now, Paul grew up Jewish. So some people might say, well, that's easy for Paul to say. He grew up Jewish. Of course he can act Jewish because he was one. But whether he was in the company of those who are weak, or those who were free, or those who were slaves, you know what he said he did? He said, I integrated myself, I became selfless, and I put self on the back burner so that even if I didn't like the company of these people, or if I didn't live like some of these people did, I put myself on the back burner in hopes that I could serve them to help them understand the gospel. I've had a lot of people I've met in life, and I've met some people who are really, really good at that. They'll talk to people from regardless of where they're from in the country or in the world, and they'll just have a conversation with them like they knew them yesterday. And they'll become selfless, regardless of what somebody's opinions or hobbies might be. They'll put their own opinions and hobbies on the back burner and have an amazing conversation all about the gospel. There are people who are good at that, aren't there? And again, that too, it's a lot easier said than done, but Paul was exceptional at that. Even though he had all of these privileges and all these rights as a Christian, he sacrificed some of those things in hopes to win people over. If he was in the company of people who were weak, he seemingly said, I act as if I was weak. Now that's a funny picture to think about, isn't it? Could you imagine a bodybuilder walking into the house of the weakest person trying to share the gospel, and instead of flexing all the time and saying, man, look how big these muscles are, saying, man, that table's kind of heavy, and kind of acting weak to help them understand the gospel? It'd be a funny picture. But in an extreme, that seems to be kind of what Paul is getting at. Now, Paul's not lying. Something else that's important to note is I think some people might take these verses and run with them and think, well, if I want to help people who are alcoholics, maybe I need to be an alcoholic too. That's not what Paul's saying at all. Because he does make it clear that he's still under the law of God. And he was not going to violate these rules that God had created. But he was going to do whatever it took, even if it meant sacrificing selfish things to help other people understand it. And a great example of this is if you just go to the chapter before, there was a big debate in Corinth about food. And the big debate was whether or not Christians could eat food offered to idols. And do you remember what some of the Christians said? They said, look, if you have a meal that's been offered to an idol, you don't need to eat it because it's been offered to an idol. But then there were some Christians who I feel like I could relate to who would say, well, that's perfectly good food. There's nothing wrong with that. Why can't we eat it? And so Paul had this big discussion that, look, even though there's nothing wrong with it, if it means I don't need to eat meat while I'm around you, that's what I'm going to do. I mean, talk about love for just a moment. Think about that. Have you ever loved somebody enough that you were willing to change your diet for them? That's how selfless Paul was. He said, if I never get to eat meat again, I'll do it if it means it'll help you understand the gospel better. Now that's selfless. That's something to think about. And you can extrapolate that maybe in all sorts of scenarios in your own life. Sacrifices you could make to help other people understand the gospel. Maybe it's putting up with a hobby you don't like that somebody else has. Maybe they like playing board games and you don't, but you know they're not a Christian. Hey, maybe you could sacrifice some hobbies for a few days to help somebody understand the gospel. All sorts of ways to think about that. But how did Paul seem to have such a knack? Well, verses 24 through 27, he was somebody who was very goal-oriented and goal-minded. He knew what his goal was in this life. And in verse 24 of 1 Corinthians 9, he said, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Paul had his eyes on a prize. And if you ever sit back and wonder, how could Paul be so focused on spreading the gospel? Because his mind, his whole life was gospel-focused. His eyes were on a heavenly and eternal prize that he wanted everybody else that was willing to listen to enjoy. And again, I know it's a lot easier said than done, but it's serious. And it's important, and it matters. And Paul took that responsibility seriously. And so for our lesson this morning, two big things. I hope that you recognize the importance of spreading the gospel. If I don't get a chance to see you tonight, I hope that I do. But if I don't, as you go throughout your week, I encourage you to think of ways to be more intentional about spreading the gospel. In the conversations that you have at work, at school, out in public. You ever just talk to random people out in public? Anybody ever do that? I know it's weird, but people used to do that a lot more often. You can just walk up and say hi to people, you shake their hand, or fist bump. It's crazy. You talk to some people in public, and they're like, "Are you talking to me, a stranger?" But you can do that. Be intentional about it. But the second big thing, I encourage you to think about how you do it. May you have that attitude of Paul and be selfless. Be selfless in sharing the gospel, doing whatever it takes. So long as we're being obedient to God, obedient to Christ, to help them understand these truths. Now, if it feels kind of open-ended, that's because it is. Because Lord willing, tonight we're going to look a little bit more into this idea. Because there's certainly a lot more that goes into it. And our goal tonight will be to look a little bit more into how we can be adequately, thoroughly equipped to go about this very, very important work. But if you're here and you're a Christian this morning, I hope that can challenge your thinking. I hope that can encourage you to think about the seriousness of spreading the gospel. But if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, and you've never heard the gospel of Jesus before, well, I encourage you to feel free to talk to me, to any of the elders or leaders here, because I'm sure we would all love the opportunity to share that with you, this gospel message of Jesus Christ, this gospel of Jesus, of how God sent His Son to live on this earth, to live a perfect life, and to die on a cross. So as Mark 16 pointed out, so that anyone who believes in Christ and is baptized into Christ can be delivered from their sins. It's a new life, and it's a life worth living. But for us as Christians, may we be eager to share that gospel with others. And so for our lesson this morning, I'll leave it at that. So I hope to see you again tonight. But if there's anything we can help you with this morning, whether it's prayers of encouragement or a response to that gospel or anything else, I would encourage you to use our time together, perhaps while we sing this song of invitation.